Imagine standing at the edge of a precipice, where the ground beneath represents our economic stability and the winds of change threaten to push us into an abyss deeper than any recession we've known. Today, I want to discuss the convergence of factors that signal not just an economic downturn, but a potential systemic crisis. The global monetary system is approaching a critical juncture. The accumulation of unsustainable debt levels coupled with geopolitical tensions and shifting economic alliances signals a potential breakdown of the established financial order. This scenario is reminiscent of historical patterns where excessive debt and loss of confidence in monetary policies have led to significant economic upheavals. The United States, as the issuer of the world's primary reserve currency, holds a unique position. However, the nation's escalating debt, which has surpassed $34 trillion, 0 cents, and persistent fiscal deficits raise concerns about the long-term viability of the dollar's dominance. When a reserve currency issuer accumulates unsustainable debt, history shows that the currency's dominant position eventually collapses. Trade tensions, particularly between the U.S. and China, exacerbate these issues. Tariff policies and protectionist measures disrupt global supply chains and erode trust among trading partners. Such actions contribute to deglobalization, prompting countries to seek alternative trade networks and currencies, thereby undermining the existing monetary framework. The shift away from multilateralism towards unilateral economic policies further destabilizes the global financial system. As nations prioritize domestic interests over collective stability, the risk of a fragmented monetary order increases. This fragmentation can lead to competitive devaluations and capital controls, reminiscent of the economic turmoil experienced during the 1930s. In response to these challenges, some countries are increasing their reserves of hard assets like gold and exploring digital currencies to reduce reliance on traditional financial systems. These moves indicate a growing skepticism about the sustainability of current monetary policies and the need for more stable and reliable stores of value. Addressing these systemic issues requires a concerted effort to implement disciplined fiscal policies, reduce deficits, and restore confidence in monetary institutions. Without such measures, the global economy may face a period of significant instability marked by currency devaluations, inflation, and diminished economic growth. It is imperative for policymakers and economic leaders to recognize the gravity of the situation and take proactive steps to reinforce the foundations of the global monetary system. Failure to do so could result in a financial crisis that surpasses previous recessions in both scale and impact. We are in the middle of a classic cycle that has repeated itself throughout history, one in which political polarization and internal conflict gradually escalate to levels that threaten the unity, functionality, and stability of a nation. The signs are clear for anyone who studies historical parallels. The United States, like many empires before it in their late stages, is undergoing deep internal divisions that go well beyond normal political disagreement. There is a growing ideological gulf between factions, with each side increasingly seeing the other not just as opposition, but as an existential threat to the country's future. This shift from policy-based debate to identity-based antagonism is dangerous. It undermines the effectiveness of democratic institutions, weakens the rule of law, and reduces the ability of governments to act decisively in moments of crisis. In such environments, elections are not perceived as legitimate transitions of power, but as high-stakes battles where the loser questions the entire system rather than conceding and preparing for the next opportunity. This breakdown in shared national purpose is not happening in a vacuum. It is the result of long-term structural forces. One of the most important is the increasing wealth and opportunity gap. When large numbers of people feel they are being left behind economically and that the system is rigged against them, they lose faith in that system. The data shows this clearly. Wage growth for the majority of the population has stagnated for decades when adjusted for inflation, while asset prices and financial markets have primarily benefited the wealthier segments of society. In this context, politics becomes a zero-sum game. People are no longer voting based on aspirational visions for the country, but out of fear. Fear that the other side will take away their rights, their resources, or their way of life. Fear is a powerful driver of conflict, and it often leads to the rise of populist leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems. These leaders frequently bypass institutional norms, appeal directly to their base, and inflame existing divisions. And in turn feeds a cycle of retaliation, entrenchment, and institutional degradation. The last time the United States was this politically divided and ideologically charged was in the years leading up to the Civil War. At that time, there were deep moral, economic, and cultural divides. Today, we see a similar pattern playing out with disagreements not only about policy, but about facts, history, and even the legitimacy of the government itself. Once that level of distrust becomes systemic, it is incredibly hard to reverse without a major restructuring event, which is usually painful. If you zoom out and study the rise and fall of great powers throughout history, from ancient Rome to the Dutch and British empires, you will find that internal conflict is often the most lethal force of decline. External threats may be dangerous, but it is internal fragmentation that breaks a society's cohesion, disrupts its leadership, and leaves it vulnerable to economic collapse or foreign influence. In essence, the biggest threats to a declining empire tend to come from within, not from abroad. Another critical factor in this process is the loss of trust in institutions. Government, media, education, law enforcement, and even the electoral system. When people no longer believe that the system is working in their interest, they stop participating in it. When they stop participating, the legitimacy of that system erodes, which in turn accelerates its breakdown. This is not just theoretical. We are already seeing a significant drop in voter turnout, faith in news sources, and civil engagement across the board. Technology, especially social media, plays a unique role in amplifying these divides. The ability to live in information silos where people are only exposed to views they already agree with intensifies confirmation bias and dehumanizes opposing viewpoints. What results is a distorted view of reality, which makes compromise nearly impossible. When each side believes they have access to the truth and the other is either deluded or evil, dialogue stops and conflict becomes inevitable. I think what we are seeing now is not a short-term disruption, but a long-term structural change. The post-World War II era, which gave rise to a period of relatively strong cohesion and institutional confidence, is fading. We are entering a new era, one that resembles more the 1930s in terms of economic dislocation, populism, geopolitical risk, and internal division. Reversing this trend is possible, but it requires leadership that is both bold and unifying. It requires structural reforms that reduce inequality and restore opportunity for the majority people. It requires a recommitment to the principles of democratic governance and shared sacrifice. None of this will be easy, and history suggests that most societies do not make these changes peacefully. But the sooner we recognize where we are in the cycle, the better chance we have of managing what comes next with stability and foresight. This is not about politics. It is about the future trajectory of a country that is facing the same tests that have defined the fate of nations for thousands of years. The question now is whether we can learn from history before we are forced to relive its most painful chapters. We are living through a time in history when the world order is being restructured. One of the defining forces behind this transition is the rise in geopolitical tensions and the breakdown of previously interdependent trade relationships. These developments are not sudden. They are the product of long-term structural changes, the shifting balance of power, and a reversal of the trend that drove globalization for decades. The global economic order that was built after World War II and solidified after the Cold War was based on the assumption that countries would benefit from integration. The flow of goods, capital, and knowledge across borders created an interconnected world where cooperation was more profitable than conflict. But that system was also built on the dominance of a single superpower, the United States, which served as the guarantor of stability and the anchor of the global reserve currency. The most significant rivalry today is between the United States and China. This competition is not just about tariffs or trade balances. It is a structural struggle between an established power trying to maintain its position and a rising power trying to gain its rightful place. Throughout history, this kind of dynamic has often led to conflict. What we are witnessing is a classic example of what historians refer to as the Thucydides trap. The early stages of this struggle played out through trade disputes. Tariffs were introduced on both sides, triggering retaliations. Then it moved into the realm of technology with bans on semiconductor exports, sanctions on firms, and restrictions on investment flows. From there, the tension spilled into the financial system with moves to reduce dependency on the dollar and the development of parallel payment systems. Each step reflects an erosion of trust and a desire for self-reliance, which reduces interdependence and raises the risk of confrontation. The economic implications of this trend are profound. Global supply chains, which were once optimized for efficiency, are now being redesigned for resilience and political alignment. Countries are shifting toward onshoring and friendshoring, bringing production back home or relocating it to allies. While this may increase security in the short term, it also raises costs and reduces global productivity. At the same time, we are seeing the formation of competing blocs. Strategic alliances are being reconfigured. Military posturing is increasing, particularly in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. Countries are being forced to choose sides, or at least to hedge their positions. This kind of polarization mirrors the pre-World War environment, when trade and diplomacy began to break down and nations started acting based on perceived national survival rather than global stability.
One of the less appreciated consequences of these geopolitical shifts is the risk to the monetary order. When there is less trust between major powers, there is less willingness to hold each other's currencies and debt. We are already seeing efforts by China, Russia, and others to reduce their exposure to the dollar by increasing gold reserves and conducting trade in alternative currencies. Over time, this could weaken the network effects that underpin the dollar-based system, especially if the United States continues to run large deficits and weaponize its financial system for sanctions. In such an environment, capital becomes more cautious and volatility increases. Investors and businesses have to deal with a higher level of uncertainty. Risk premiums rise. Long-term planning becomes more difficult, and confidence in stability begins to erode. This is the cost of fragmentation, the loss of a cohesive, rules-based system that has governed global interactions for the better part of a century. The biggest risk is not necessarily war in the traditional sense, although that risk cannot be ignored. The bigger threat is a long-term breakdown in cooperation. When nations no longer trust each other and no longer see mutual benefit in collaboration, the global system becomes fragile. Problems that require international coordination, like climate change, pandemics, and financial crises, become harder to solve, and eventually, the lack of coordination leads to outcomes that are far worse than the problems themselves. This is why it is critical to understand the nature of the transition we are going through. It is not just a cycle. It is a restructuring. The old order is weakening, and a new one has not yet formed. How peacefully or violently that transition occurs will depend on the wisdom of leadership, the adaptability of institutions, and the willingness of people to learn from history. Those who have studied the past know that periods like this have happened before. They come with uncertainty, conflict, and change, but they also offer the opportunity for renewal and reinvention. Whether that happens peacefully or through crisis is the defining question of our time. We are entering a period that bears striking similarities to the late 1930s, a time when economic, political, and social forces converged to reshape the global order. Understanding these parallels is crucial for anticipating potential challenges and navigating the complexities of the current environment. In the 1930s, the world grappled with the aftermath of the Great Depression, characterized by massive debt burdens, deflationary pressures, and a loss of confidence in financial institutions. Governments and central banks responded with aggressive monetary and fiscal policies, including lowering interest rates and implementing large-scale public works programs. While these measures provided temporary relief, they also led to unintended consequences, such as asset bubbles and increased wealth disparities. Today, we observe similar patterns. Following the 2008 financial crisis, central banks around the world adopted unconventional monetary policies, including quantitative easing and near-zero interest rates, to stimulate economic growth. These actions have inflated asset prices, benefiting those who own financial assets while leaving others behind, thereby exacerbating income and wealth inequalities. This growing divide fuels social unrest and political polarization, reminiscent of the societal tensions of the 1930s. The current geopolitical landscape also mirrors that of the pre-World War Roman II era. Rising powers challenge the dominance of established nations, leading to increased competition and the potential for conflict. Trade disputes, technological rivalries, and territorial disagreements contribute to a climate of uncertainty and mistrust among nations. Such dynamics can disrupt global supply chains, hinder economic growth, and destabilize international relations. Furthermore, the effectiveness of traditional policy tools is diminishing. With interest rates already at historically low levels, central banks have limited capacity to respond to future economic downturns. Fiscal policy faces constraints due to high debt levels and political gridlock, reducing the ability of governments to implement timely and effective stimulus measures. This limited policy space increases the risk of prolonged economic stagnation or a deeper crisis. In light of these challenges, it is imperative to adopt a comprehensive and forward-looking approach. Policymakers must address structural issues such as income inequality and social mobility to foster inclusive economic growth. International cooperation is essential to manage geopolitical tensions and promote stability. Investors should diversify their portfolios and consider risk management strategies to navigate potential market volatility. By studying the lessons of the 1930s and recognizing the similarities to our current situation, we can better prepare for the uncertainties ahead. Proactive and coordinated efforts are necessary to mitigate risks, support economic resilience, and ensure a more equitable and stable global order. The long-term health of an economy is determined not just by how much it grows, but by how well it manages its finances during different phases of the cycle. Throughout history, the rise and fall of empires and economic powers has often hinged on their ability to maintain fiscal discipline. When governments spend far more than they earn for extended periods of time, and especially when that spending is funded by printing money rather than productive output, the consequences tend to be severe. Today, we are witnessing a pattern that has repeated itself across centuries and civilizations. A period of high debt, political pressure for more spending, and limited willingness to make hard fiscal choices. The temptation to avoid short-term pain by relying on borrowing is strong, but it comes at a long-term cost that becomes increasingly difficult to manage. The signs are clear for anyone paying attention. Debt levels relative to GDP are at or near record highs in many of the world's largest economies. In the United States, public debt has exceeded the size of the entire economy and continues to grow rapidly. Interest costs on that debt are rising as central banks increase rates to combat inflation. This creates a vicious cycle. As rates rise, the cost of servicing debt increases, which puts more pressure on budgets, leading to even higher deficits, which in turn require more borrowing. Eventually, the system becomes unstable. The only way to sustain such levels of spending without triggering a default or political crisis is for central banks to intervene by buying government debt. In other words, to monetize the deficits. But doing this over the long term leads to currency devaluation and inflation. It erodes the purchasing power of savings, damages confidence in the currency, and distorts financial markets. We have already seen early signs of this dynamic playing out. The extraordinary fiscal and monetary measures taken during the pandemic were necessary to avoid an immediate collapse, but they also pushed the system closer to its limits. Inflation surged beyond target levels. Asset bubbles formed, income inequality widened as those closest to the sources of capital gained the most, while the broader population faced rising costs and stagnating real wages. The lesson from history is clear. Fiscal indiscipline rarely ends well. Whether we look at ancient Rome, the final stages of the British Empire, or more recent examples like Latin America in the 1980s, the pattern is the same. A government expands its commitments beyond its means. It avoids politically difficult reforms. It borrows excessively. Eventually, it must choose between default, austerity, or inflation. None of these outcomes are easy. Each has serious economic and social consequences. The challenge now is that we are running out of room. The idea that deficits do not matter in a low-rate environment has proven to be short-sighted. Rates do rise, debt does accumulate, markets do respond when confidence is lost. When investors begin to question whether a country can service its obligations in real terms, they demand a higher risk premium. That makes borrowing more expensive and accelerates the feedback loop. The solution is not to cut spending recklessly or to raise taxes indiscriminately. The solution is to align spending with long-term productive investments and to ensure that public finance is structured for sustainability. It means prioritizing projects that generate real returns for the economy. It means reforming entitlement programs in ways that preserve their core benefits while making them financially viable. It means building trust by showing that policy decisions are made based on long long-term logic, not short-term political gain. This kind of fiscal discipline is rare in late-stage economic systems. The political incentives work against it. No one wants to take away benefits or raise taxes, but history shows that leaders who fail to act early face much more painful consequences later, and those consequences are not just economic, they are societal. They involve unrest, division, and ultimately, a breakdown of trust in institutions. In the end, discipline is not about austerity for its own sake. It is about preserving the flexibility to respond to future crises. It is about ensuring that the financial system remains credible and that capital continues to flow where it is needed most. It is about protecting the value of the currency and maintaining the ability to invest in national priorities over time. We are now at a stage in the cycle where the cost of fiscal mismanagement is rising. The longer corrective action is delayed, the more severe the adjustment will have to be. The time to act is not after markets lose faith or inflation runs out of control. The time to act is now while trust remains, while the tools are still available, and while there is still a chance to steer the system toward a more stable and sustainable path. The storm clouds are gathering, and the signs are clear. We stand at a critical juncture where inaction could lead to a crisis surpassing any recession in recent memory. However, with informed decision-making and collective effort, we can steer away from the precipice and towards a more stable and prosperous future.